Our first panelist today, it's a great honor to introduce Rupa Marya, is professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she practices and teaches internal medicine. Her work sits at the nexus of climate, health, and racial justice. Dr. Marya founded the Deep Medicine Circle, a women of color-led organization committed to healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, restoration, and learning, which sounds a lot like the work of Gasa Atabek's Ashe in the South Bronx. I'll have to tell you about that one of these days. Together with Raj Patel, she co-authored the best-selling book examining the health impacts of colonialism on bodies, right? And stories and societies and planet, called Inflamed: Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. I like to do promos for my comrades, so I just did that. Don't worry about it. It's part of the package. And so what I'd like you to focus on, or Rupa said she will focus on, is deep medicine. Thank you, comrade. Thank you, sister, if I can say that, for your work, your witness, and your life. Bring it on.
All right. Well, first of all, congratulations, Rob, on this great accomplishment. And thank you for your gift to all of us with your analysis in this important book. I'm really excited about it. You know, I'm a frontline physician. I work as a hospital medicine doctor. I serve our community impacted by racism and police violence and racism in general as a form of biological warfare. When I was, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was thinking, you know, for sure we're going to get all these unhoused, 8,000 unhoused people in off the streets. It's time, like, let's take care of people. And of course, you know, in spite of a unanimous board of supervisors in San Francisco voting to get everybody in these 30,000 vacant hotel rooms, that didn't happen. Then during the Delta surge with the, you know, the AQI was over 400 because of all of our wildfires. People couldn't breathe healthy air. I thought, okay, now with the Delta surge killing all these people and the air pollution, now we're going to get everybody inside these empty hotel rooms. And in fact, that didn't happen. And so to me, it made me think, as a physician, how much death do we need to see? How much suffering do we need to see in order to open up these goddamn doors to let the people in? And so that is a question of deep medicine. And so I just want to share just a couple thoughts about what that is and why that's important, and how your book really plays to that. So I'm thrilled to announce that Nature requested a commentary about revising our medical education. So what would you do to change our medical education? And I said we'd put medical students in service of communities of struggle for at least 3 to 6 months, which is a lot like the Cuban model, which I think that Vijay will talk a little bit about, but we will, you know, invert the power structure of how we come to know things in medicine, and how we come to understand what's wrong, and how we come to address health agendas based on those who are most impacted by the social structures that create the poor health outcomes. And when we look at COVID, it is created by poor health. The poor health outcomes are manufactured by design. It is not a mistake. It is not a, well, whoops. The 1.2 plus million people who are dead in the United States were, most of those were avoidable deaths. And it's important to understand that. So when we look at how social structures get translated into the microbiology, into our cells, I just want to share that, because as we think of long COVID, and now that we're faced with millions of people with long COVID, this is a phenomenon and a pathway that is going to become, it already is super important. This is a pathway by which COVID, the virus, was a match to a just dry tinderbox that had been created through the social structures of colonial capitalism. So what's happening on the cellular level with the damaging aspects of societies arranged with power arranged through colonialism and capitalism specifically, is these hierarchies of power create social structures that get translated into our molecular messaging systems. And it's important to understand what these are, so that when we look at these phenomena of health disparities and outcomes, we're not surprised, and we know actually what's happening, and not just to explain what's happening, but to understand then what the prescription is. So when it comes to chronic inflammatory disease, of which now long COVID looks like it's going to become one of these things, the sum of lifetime exposure, so what's called the exposome of a person, is more predictive of whether or not you're going to develop a chronic inflammatory disease than even your genome. But when we learn medicine in medical school, we're taught relentlessly about the genome and the gene protein and increasingly individualistic precision medicine, without understanding that the exposome and all of its additions over a lifetime end up impacting our cells. So when you look at what's happening on the cellular level, these damaging exposures added up over time create telomere erosion, DNA damage, mitochondrial dysfunction. We're seeing a lot of that with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, oxidative stress, and epigenetic changes in our replicating cells. So these are our somatic cells, not our germline cells, but all the other cells in our bodies that replicate. When cells age prematurely through damage, they enter a cell cycle arrest and an early senescence, which is an early aging. Cells that arrest their replicative cycle through damage undergo a remodeling of their DNA material that, and they end up taking on a phenotype called the SASP cell, or the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. And Raj Patel and I went through a lot of great detail in our book to give this scientific knowledge to our comrades so that people can understand that these structures that will make sure that, let's say, Black and brown neighborhoods, indigenous neighborhoods have less access to clean water, less access to trees that might mitigate the impact of high temperatures, less access to, safety without over-policing, that these structures are forms of biological warfare, because these SASP cells go on to become little factories of pro-inflammatory molecular mediators. And we're finding these cells, so they're pumping out these messengers in the cells that create damage in the tissues. And we're finding these SASP cells in all of the diseases I take care of as a hospital medicine physician in a society organized through colonial capitalism. As we're finding them in the blood vessels of people with atherosclerosis, we're finding them in the liver tissue of people with liver fibrosis or cirrhosis. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is now the leading cause of end-stage liver disease in the United States, surpassing alcoholic liver disease. We're finding it in the brain cells of Alzheimer's patients. We're finding it in the pancreatic cells of diabetic patients. And we're finding it in severe COVID and long COVID too. So this virus is impacting the way our cells age, prematurely aging our cells through damage, and leading to a hyperinflammatory profile in the body. As a side note, I'll just mention the Monte Nankemo, who's an indigenous forest protector in the Amazon, is a dear friend. She is involved in protecting over 500,000 acres of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And their communities are part of the uncontacted tribes. Of the virus circulating through their communities 3 different times, there are about 2,500 people who were infected with the same clinical syndrome. Some people tested, they just assumed everyone got it who presented with the same syndrome. 0 people died. 0 people died because, and in their communities, they have very low rates of cancer. They have very low rates of atherosclerosis and age-related, actually have 0 age-related hypertension. And that's because the way in which they live in relationship to the web of life and to each other through politics and economies of care is the opposite of what we see here in society structured through colonial capitalism. So when we see the health outcomes that we're going to continue to see, not just with the acute phase of COVID, but now the long COVID and the ongoing recurrence of COVID, and the pandemic is not endemic because we have no predictable pattern of disease frequency. We're seeing, I haven't seen a predictable pattern yet, but we're going to see the same people who have been engineered to suffer and die and self-destruct under systems of colonial capitalism do the same thing. And that won't change until we engage in deep medicine, which is restructuring the societies around us along axes of care. And that is my 5 minutes. Was that 5 minutes?